right, so this is big news. Apple just announced they're partnering with Google to power the next generation of Siri with Gemini. We're talking about a 1.2 trillion parameter model. That's 8 times larger than Apple's current 150 billion parameter on-device model. As someone who's spent years building infrastructure, my immediate question is, how does Apple maintain their privacy story while outsourcing their AI brain to Google?
That's exactly the right question to ask. And honestly, the architecture they've laid out is fascinating from an engineering perspective. Apple isn't just handing user queries to Google. They've designed a multi-layer system that keeps their privacy guarantees intact while getting access to Gemini's capabilities.
Walk me through the architecture. What does this actually look like under the hood?
It's a 3-component system. First, you have the Query Planner, which is powered by Gemini. That handles intent understanding, figuring out what the user is actually asking for. Second, there's the Knowledge Search system, which runs entirely on Apple's on-device foundation models. And third, there's the Summarizer, which is also powered by Gemini.
Wait, so Gemini is handling the understanding and the summarization, but the actual data retrieval happens locally?
Exactly. Think of it like a sanitization layer. The on-device model acts as a privacy buffer. When you ask Siri something like, "Find that restaurant my wife mentioned last week," the on-device model parses your personal context, your messages, calendar, contacts, and constructs a sanitized query that can be safely sent to Gemini without exposing the raw personal data.
So it's not that Google never sees any query at all. It's that they only see the processed, anonymized version after Apple's on-device model has stripped out the identifiable stuff.
Right, and here's where it gets really interesting for infrastructure folks. Gemini doesn't run on Google's regular cloud infrastructure for this use case. It runs on Apple's private cloud compute servers.
Apple is hosting Google's model? That's unexpected. Why would they do it that way?
Privacy enforcement at the infrastructure level. Apple's private cloud compute, or PCC, is built on custom Apple Silicon servers running a hardened OS derived from iOS and macOS. They've got a trusted execution monitor, attestation before every single request, and, this is the key part, no persistent storage of user data. The requests come in, get processed, and the data is gone.
So even if Google theoretically wanted to train on user data, they couldn't? Because the infrastructure physically doesn't allow it.
Precisely. The deal is structured so that Gemini is essentially white-labeled. There's no Google branding visible to users. From a user's perspective, they're just talking to Siri, a better, smarter Siri.
Okay, but let's talk numbers for a second. Bloomberg is reporting this deal is worth about $1 billion annually. For that kind of money, what is Apple actually getting?
They're getting the ability to leapfrog their AI capabilities without the multi-year investment in training their own frontier model. Their current Apple Intelligence model is around 150 billion parameters. Jumping to 1.2 trillion parameters isn't just an incremental improvement, it's a step function change in capability. The new Siri is expected to launch with iOS 26.4 in March.
March 2026. That's 2 months away. For platform engineers, what should they be thinking about now?
A few things. First, if you're building anything that integrates with Siri or Apple's ecosystem, expect a significant capability upgrade. The kinds of queries Siri can handle will be dramatically different. Second, Tim Cook specifically mentioned continued interest in Model Context Protocol, or MCP, during the announcement.
MCP? That's interesting. So Apple is still pushing for a standardized way for AI models to connect to external data sources?
It seems like it, and that makes sense when you think about the architecture. If you have an on-device model doing knowledge retrieval and a cloud model doing understanding and summarization, you need clean interfaces between them. MCP could be how third-party apps expose their data to this new Siri pipeline.
Let me ask the uncomfortable question. What about OpenAI? Apple announced that ChatGPT integration last year. Is that dead now?
Apple says no changes to the ChatGPT partnership for now, but the way they described it is telling. ChatGPT currently handles what Apple calls world knowledge queries, things that require broad reasoning that Siri couldn't handle. With Gemini powering the foundational intelligence layer, that distinction gets blurry.
So ChatGPT might become the premium option while Gemini handles the bulk of interactions?
That's one possible reading. Or ChatGPT could gradually phase out as Gemini-powered Siri gets more capable. The deal being non-exclusive is interesting too. Apple explicitly structured it so they're not locked in.
Non-exclusive. So Apple could add Anthropic or Meta or whoever else later?
In theory, yes, and that's actually great architecture from Apple's perspective. They've built this privacy-preserving wrapper, the PCC infrastructure, the on-device buffer layer, that can host different foundation models. They're not betting on one provider. They're building the infrastructure to swap providers if needed.
So for platform engineers building similar systems, what's the lesson here?
Build the infrastructure layer first. Apple didn't rush to train the biggest model. They built the privacy infrastructure, the routing layer, the on-device capabilities, and then they could plug in best-in-class models from partners. That's infrastructure thinking, not model thinking.
We should talk about what this means for developers integrating with Apple's ecosystem. If Siri becomes dramatically more capable, what changes?
The bar for Siri shortcuts and app intents is about to go up significantly. Right now, developers expose structured actions that Siri can invoke, like add to my grocery list or start a workout. With a 1.2 trillion parameter model doing intent understanding, Siri could potentially infer what action to take from much more natural, ambiguous requests.
So instead of training users to speak in specific patterns, Siri might actually understand context and intent like a human would?
That's the promise. And for developers, it means you need to think less about rigid trigger phrases and more about exposing rich semantic metadata about what your app can do. MCP might be the protocol for that, a way to describe capabilities that an AI can discover and invoke.
Let's touch on the community reaction. I've seen some Apple users expressing concern about Google AI slop invading their devices.
There's definitely a segment of Apple's user base that specifically chose Apple because they wanted to avoid Google. And for those users, the fact that Gemini is running on Apple's PCC servers and user data never reaches Google's infrastructure is an important distinction. But I get the concern. It's still Google technology.
And on the other side, privacy advocates are noting that Apple's architecture actually does protect user data in meaningful ways. This isn't like using Google Search where your queries are logged and used for ads.
Right. The key insight is that Apple is treating Gemini as a pure capability layer. They're not buying into Google's data model. They're licensing the model weights and running them on infrastructure designed specifically to prevent data extraction.
For the engineers listening, what should be on their radar over the next few months?
First, watch for Apple's developer documentation on the new Siri capabilities. There will likely be new APIs for deep integration. Second, start thinking about how your apps could expose structured data through something like MCP. Third, if you're building AI features, consider this hybrid architecture: local processing for privacy-sensitive tasks, cloud processing for capability-intensive tasks.
And if you're building infrastructure for AI workloads, the PCC architecture is worth studying. Custom silicon, hardened OS, attestation, no persistent storage. That's a reference implementation for privacy-preserving AI inference at scale.
Exactly. Apple has essentially open-sourced the design principles, if not the implementation. They've published papers on how PCC works. For anyone building enterprise AI infrastructure with privacy requirements, it's required reading.
One last thought. The timing here is interesting. This announcement comes right as we're seeing a surge of concern about AI governance and data privacy. Apple is positioning themselves as the company that can give you the frontier AI capabilities without sacrificing privacy.
It's a powerful message. You can have the best AI in your pocket, and your data stays yours. Whether they fully deliver on that promise with iOS 26.4 remains to be seen, but the architectural approach is sound. They've built the infrastructure to make that promise credible.
For anyone working in this space, this is a landmark moment. The largest consumer technology company just validated the model-as-a-service approach with privacy-preserving infrastructure. That's the pattern we'll be building on for the next decade.
And that's the take-home for platform engineers. Build the infrastructure layer first, design for privacy at the architecture level, and stay flexible on which models you integrate, because the landscape is moving fast, and the best model today might not be the best model tomorrow.
That's AI Daily for today. Thanks for listening. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you tomorrow with more AI news and insights.